We are gathering today on the ancestral and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Anishinaabe peoples, on the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3, signed in 1792. We are gathering today because the caretakers of this land since time immemorial were displaced from their lands by colonial deceit. Because as a group of climate-concerned individuals, we must fight for the land's return to its original stewards. Because we know settler colonialism is the root of this current environmental crisis. In a country, an illegal occupation built upon genocide and greed, we are led to believe our bodies, our homes, differentiate from our land, our homes. My ancestry is of Irish, German, English, and Scottish descent, as well as Indigenous relations on what is so-called Newfoundland and Labrador today. I'm determined to reconnect with my nation and language of my ancestral territory on Turtle Island in the process of decolonizing myself. So I implore you to speak with your families and learn the series of events and locations that led you to being here now. We need to know where we come from if we want to fully come to terms with where we are now, still in the midst of state-sanctioned racism and destruction, in order to shift on living on respected lands. And if this made-up government's goals to disconnect body and land has succeeded in a lost family tree, look to those around you now as we fight for the land and its people together. So thank you for coming into the streets. I'm Jill, and I recently spent 3 months defending southern Vancouver Island's last intact valley of old-growth forests, where no treaty nor consent to the Indian Act ever took place on unceded and unsurrendered Pacheedaht and Dididat territory, colonially known as Fairy Creek. I can't even say that word. And undisturbed headwaters, where ancient cedar, hemlock, and fir sing in winds they well adjusted to, featuring dense understory whose song is told in emerald ripples, the bass closer to my ear's height. Not to mention all the organisms unseen and below, the bass of an orchestra booming with life. Some of the last of an ecosystem's kind on our planet, capturing and storing grotesque amounts of carbon in its rich biomass basement. My jaw fully dropped when I first set foot in an untouched forest, knowing less than 1% of productive ancient forests remained in British Columbia. At this point, the RCMP having arrested one person already, I quit my job and blockaded it. Smiling, determined, heart-filled faces, meals shared from hand-built kitchens, nightly meetings to strategize and check in with one another. No one in charge of ourselves but ourselves. I wanted to pinch myself in this dreamlike scenario before the sound of the chainsaw's reapings brought me back into the reality of corporate greed and profit. I came to the Fairy Creek blockade full-time in May as an invited guest by Pacheedaht Elder Bill Jones, who gave his blessing to the action. In retrospect, after around 7 months of people coming without consent to defend his lands, I spent a long time confused about how other members of his community, with seemingly more jurisdiction, the Band Council, wanted protesters off their lands. And this is a quote by the niece of Elder Bill Jones, Katie George Jim, surrounding this concept. The British Crown is dependent on colonial rule of law carried out by the federal and provincial governments, policies and police which all explicitly seek to undermine the inherent rights and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples. We see this take form in Indian band nations, Indian residential and day schools, Indian hospitals, potlatch bans, and treaty negotiations, to name a few. as well as the murdered and missing Indigenous women and two-spirited queer folks, which is why I'm wearing a red handprint on my face today. And the end of that quote by Katie George Jim. Federally instituted Indian band nations are by design meant to obliterate relationships to land and families, consent and matriarchal decision-making, and international agreements between other Indigenous peoples. Pacheedaht First Nation is no exception to this condition of colonialism. While the systemic complexities of this movement have caused mainstream media to shy away, we held strong knowing we stood on the right side of history. To date, there have been around 700 arrests, and while I was never arrested, I held down frontline camps, awaiting and preparing for enforcement, as well as lots of communication work behind the scenes. The atrocious tactics used by the RCMP and the Teal Jones Logging Company must be held accountable for. There are reports of fallen individuals from defense contraptions 25 feet off the ground. Targeted violence of Black, Indigenous people of color, leading to several hospital visits. Most of these arrests were behind illegal exclusion zones created by police who deny access to legal observers and media, actions the Supreme Court have even deemed unlawful. Through speaking with the hereditary chief, Victor Peter, his wish was for a merriment, a balance of hard blockading with chained-in people with art and beautiful creations of any kind to go along with it. I spread that message across all camps like wildfire, with signs and songs appearing more than ever. So one day, I decided to challenge this unjust exclusion zone, the arbitrary yellow line. At 6 a.m., a group of about 40 of us hiked up to Waterfall Camp, where one where industry had been heavily hitting on the road that leads up to the headwaters. When the excavator came and cleared our blocks made up of boulders and branches, I stood my ground in the middle of the road, screaming at the top of my lungs, "What is going on here? What are you doing?" The court's injunction declaring protesters blocking the road would be arrested was read by the police, who trailed behind the yellow cat. So I retreated back into the camp, surrounded by song and brave folks locked into PVC tubes in the ground. The whole day, I tended a fire and cleaned up the camp that lied behind the police tape, multiple officers attempting to grab me, knowing that if I wasn't blocking, as declared by the court, I could not be arrested. I asserted my human right to move my body and sing. I checked in with those in hard blocks. I staged all the camp's garbage right in front of the cops, creating an artistic display in hopes to convey a message that these colonial figures created a mess and it's about time they picked it up. Woo! Instead, I was met with, "You can't put that there, and you're making more of a mess than you realize." With people videoing across the yellow tape, I continued to create garbage art for hours in the blazing sun. The police patrolled the camp in search of hidden contraband and soon stopped in awe of the color-coordinated displays I had created with camping supplies and chunks of nearby nature. They were stunned out of their job that day, stopping arrests after I kindly asked them to. That day, I did more than I realized I could. I created in the midst of mass destruction. So I ask you all today, what will you create? I hope to create every week some sort of occupation outside of municipal offices, federal offices, and the police station, as well as looking more into the old growth here in Ontario, and perhaps creating a blockade with consent by the First Nations near Temagami, as I know that region is set for road building come springtime. So please reach out if you're interested in something like that. And thank you so much.